The wind was a blade against the high plains, sharp and incessant, carving away at the land and the spirit. It found every crack in the old barn, whistling a desolate tune through the warped planks. For Alara, huddled in the hay with her two younger sisters, it was the sound of the world ending. Or perhaps the sound of their world having already ended, and this was merely the echo. The air was thick with the scent of dry dust, old iron, and the animal musk of the giant who owned the place. A giant who now, according to the Apache chief, owned them. They had been a burden, she knew. 3 sisters, born too small for a world that valued size and strength. Their own people, settlers who had scraped a meager existence from the unforgiving soil, had cast them out after their parents succumbed to the fever. Too many mouths to feed, they'd said. Mouths that belonged to bodies not built for the plow or the axe. They had been traded, a pathetic offering for peace, to the Chiricahua. And the Apache, in a gesture Alara could not comprehend, be it cruelty, pity, or some inscrutable wisdom, had brought them here. To him. His name, they had heard the chief DeSoto say it once, was Silas. He was a man built on a scale that defied belief, a creature of myth more than flesh and blood. His shoulders were as broad as the barn door, his hands thick slabs of calloused meat capable of bending steel. He moved with a ponderous, deliberate grace that was somehow more intimidating than sudden aggression. He had stood there, silent as a mountain, while DeSoto had gestured to the 3 of them, cowering like field mice in the chief's shadow. They are clever. They are skilled with the needle and the hearth if you give them one, DeSoto had said, his voice level, betraying no emotion. They will not be a burden if you are wise. He had then looked Silas directly in the eye, a long, unblinking gaze that seemed to pass a sentence. You are a man alone. They are women alone. You will be their shelter. You're going to be their husband. The word had hung in the air, monstrous and absurd. Husband. Silas had not reacted. His face, weathered and stern, remained a mask of stone. He had simply given a slow, almost imperceptible nod. And then DeSoto and his warriors had mounted their ponies and melted back into the landscape, leaving the 3 sisters in the suffocating silence of the giant's barn. Now, hours later, the terror had settled from a frantic, screaming thing into a cold, heavy dread in Alara's stomach. She held Lyra and Celia close, their small bodies trembling against hers. Lyra, the middle sister, was weeping silently, her face buried in Alara's shoulder. Celia, the youngest, was rigid with fear, her wide eyes fixed on the sliver of fading light under the barn door. Alara was the eldest, the protector. It was a role she had assumed the day their mother died, a weight far too heavy for her small frame. She had to be strong. She had to think. But her thoughts were a storm of dust and panic. The word husband was a brand on her mind. Did it mean he would force himself on them? All of them? The thought was a vile, coiling serpent in her gut. She looked at her sisters, so fragile, and a wave of protective fury washed over her, useless as it was. She would die before she let him harm them. A small, fierce death it would be, but a death nonetheless. The heavy thud of his footsteps outside made them all flinch. The bar on the outside of the door scraped, a sound of finality, of a cage being locked. He was not coming in. He was sealing them in for the night. A moment later, a small wooden panel near the floor, one they hadn't noticed, slid open. A rough-spun blanket was pushed through, followed by a tin canteen of water and 3 pieces of hard, dry bread. The panel slid shut. There was no kindness in the gesture. It was the perfunctory care one might give to livestock. Sustenance. Nothing more. Lyra's sobs grew louder, muffled by the hay. Hush now, Alara whispered, her own voice tight. We must eat. We must keep our strength. She crawled to the offering and brought it back. The blanket was coarse, but it was thick, and the night was growing colder. The water was metallic and lukewarm, but it soothed the raw scratchiness in their throats. The bread was nearly tasteless, but it was food. They ate in silence, the sound of their own chewing unervingly loud in the cavernous space. Alara portioned the water, making sure Celia drank the most. She broke her own bread in half and gave the pieces to her sisters, ignoring the gnawing emptiness in her own belly. She was the eldest. She would endure. As darkness consumed the barn, leaving them in a blackness so complete it felt like being buried alive, Alara stared into the void. She thought of the giant Silas. She had watched his eyes when DeSoto spoke. They were not cruel eyes. They were empty. A profound, desolate loneliness resided in their gray depths. She had seen that same look in the mirror after their parents were gone. It was the look of someone who had been alone for a very long time. Perhaps, she thought, a desperate, flickering ember of hope igniting in the cold darkness of her fear. Perhaps DeSoto had not been passing a sentence of violation. Perhaps he had been forging a treaty not between peoples, but between solitudes. A giant of a man and 3 women too small for the world. For outcasts, pushed together by a land that had no place for them. The thought was little comfort, but it was something. It was a thread to cling to in the suffocating dark. She wrapped her sisters in the coarse blanket and her own thin arms, and listened to the blade of the wind, waiting for the dawn. The days bled into one another, each marked by the same stark routine. At dawn, the panel would slide open, and a meager breakfast would appear. At dusk, the same for supper. Water was replenished. They never saw him. They only heard him. The rhythmic, ringing clang of a hammer on an anvil from a nearby shed. The grunt of effort as he split firewood. The heavy, solitary tread of his boots. He was a creature of sound and shadow. A constant, unseen presence that governed their small existence. The barn became their world. A world of dust motes dancing in the shafts of light that pierced the gloom, of the sweet, cloying smell of old hay, of the scurrying of mice in the walls. The initial, sharp-edged terror began to dull, replaced by a monotonous, grinding uncertainty. They were prisoners, but they were alive. They were fed, but they were not free. It was Lyra who began to fray first. Her quiet weeping turned into long periods of vacant staring. She stopped eating, pushing her bread away. "There's no point," she whispered one afternoon, her voice thin as a spider's thread. "We're just waiting for him to decide what to do with us." Celia, ever the quiet one, simply grew more withdrawn, her thumb finding its way to her mouth, a habit she had abandoned years ago. Alara knew she had to do something. Passivity was a slow death. They could not simply wait in the hay like animals for slaughter or salvation. They had to assert their own existence, however small. They had to make this cage a home. "No," Alara said, her voice firm, startling her sisters. "We are not waiting. We are living. And we will not live in filth." She stood up, her small frame filled with a sudden, desperate purpose. She found a stiff, broken piece of board and began to sweep a section of the barn floor. It was a futile gesture against years of accumulated dirt and grime, but it was an action. It was a declaration. Lyra and Celia watched her, their expressions a mixture of confusion and awe. For hours Alara worked, her arms aching, her hands raw, until a small patch of the packed earth was clean. She then took their single blanket, shook it out with violent snaps in the air, and folded it neatly in their cleared corner. "This is our space," she declared, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Here we are not prisoners. We are home." The next morning, when the food panel opened, there was an addition to their usual rations. A small, worn broom. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. He had seen. He had watched them. The thought was both terrifying and strangely validating. He had not punished her for her defiance. He had acknowledged it. He had given her a tool. It was a turning point. A silent conversation had begun. Over the next few weeks, the sisters, led by Alara, transformed their corner of the barn. They used the broom to sweep a larger area clean. They found old, discarded grain sacks, and with nimble fingers, Lyra, roused from her despair by purpose, began to stitch them into rudimentary mattresses, stuffing them with the softest hay. Celia, who had a gentle touch, found a small family of feral cats living in the rafters. She began leaving a tiny portion of her bread for them, And soon, a sleek mother cat would bring her kittens down, allowing Celia to stroke their backs. Their world was still confined, but it was now a world of their own making. They were no longer just surviving, they were creating. One afternoon, Alara grew bold. Silas had a pile of work clothes near the main door, torn and stained. She saw a shirt with a ripped sleeve, a pair of trousers with a seam coming undone. She remembered DeSoto's words. Skilled with the needle. It was a risk. To touch his things felt like a transgression. But what more could he do to them? She found a discarded piece of twine, and using a sharpened nail she'd found, Lyra painstakingly unraveled the twine into finer threads. With these, and a needle fashioned from a sliver of bone, they set to work. Alara washed the garments as best she could in a bucket of rainwater collected from a leak in the roof. Then Lyra, her fingers moving with an artistry that seemed out of place in the grime of the barn, mended the rips. Her stitches were tiny and perfect, the repairs almost invisible. They folded the clean, mended clothes and left them in a neat pile where the dirty ones had been. Then they retreated to their corner, their hearts pounding, and waited. The sound of his boots that evening was heavier than usual. The door groaned open. It was the first time he had entered while there was still light in the sky. The three sisters froze, pressing themselves against the barn wall. Silas filled the doorway, his massive frame blocking the setting sun. He stood there for a long moment, his eyes adjusting to the dim interior. His gaze swept over the swept floor, the neatly folded blanket, the makeshift mattresses. It lingered on Celia, who sat with the mother cat purring in her small lap. Finally, his eyes fell upon the pile of mended clothes. He walked over to them, his steps slow and deliberate. He picked up the shirt, his huge, clumsy-looking fingers surprisingly gentle as they traced the line of Lyra's stitches. He held it for a long time, his back to them, his head bowed. Alara held her breath. Was he angry? He turned, and for the first time, she saw his face clearly in the dim light. The stony mask was gone. In its place was an expression of profound, aching bewilderment. He looked at them not as property or as prisoners, but as a puzzle he could not solve. His gaze fell on Alara, and his mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came out. Instead, he gave another one of his slow, almost imperceptible nods. Then he turned and left, leaving the door slightly ajar. The next morning, beside their breakfast, was a small stack of worn-out leather scraps, a proper needle and a spool of real thread. A trade had been made. A language had been found. It was not a language of words, but of work, of mending what was broken. They mended his clothes. He provided the means. They brought order to his chaos. He provided shelter. The word husband still echoed in the back of Alara's mind, but its meaning was beginning to shift. It was less a threat of ownership and more a statement of fact. A partnership born not of affection, but of stark, mutual necessity. They were four broken things, a giant and three miniatures, slowly, silently, stitching a life together in the wilderness. The seasons turned, marked not by a calendar but by the changing quality of the light through the barn's cracks and the ferocity of the wind. The arrangement settled into a rhythm, a silent dance of provision and labor. The sisters' corner of the barn was now an established territory, clean and orderly. Silas had left them 3 wooden crates to use as a table and chairs, and an old iron pot in which they could heat water over a small, carefully tended fire pit he had built for them just outside the barn door. He never crossed the invisible line into their space, and they never ventured far from the barn and the forge. Alara found herself watching him constantly, her fear replaced by a deep, abiding curiosity. She learned the cadence of his work, the sharp, furious ringing of the hammer when he was shaping a plowshare, the softer, more rhythmic tapping when he was crafting something delicate, like a hinge or a buckle. He was a master of his craft. She saw the way his massive hands, which could crush a man's skull, could also coax a graceful curve from a piece of red-hot iron. He was not a brute. He was an artist whose medium was steel and fire. She learned his solitude. He spoke to no one, for no one ever came. The homestead was an island in a vast, empty sea of prairie grass and distant, hazy mountains. Once a month, he would load his wagon with finished tools and journey towards the far-off settlement, returning days later with sacks of flour, salt, and other necessities. On those days, the silence of the homestead was different. It was not the comfortable silence of his presence, but a hollow, anxious quiet. The sisters would find themselves listening for the rumble of his wagon wheels, a sound that now signaled safety. One evening, after he returned from such a trip, he left something new beside their meal: a bolt of plain cotton cloth and 3 small, leather-soled shoes. Shoes made exactly to their size. Lyra and Celia gasped in delight, their faces alight with a joy Alara had not seen in years. Celia slipped her feet into the tiny shoes, a perfect fit, and did a small, clumsy pirouette in the dirt. Lyra held the cloth to her cheek, her eyes shining with the possibilities of new dresses, of feeling like a woman again instead of a waif in rags. Alara's reaction was more complex. She looked at the shoes, at the perfect, tiny stitches holding the leather together. He had made these. He had taken the measure of their feet with his eyes, had worked the tough leather with his huge hands, crafting something of such delicacy and care. It was the most intimate gesture he had yet made, a confession of attention, of thought. It was terrifying. It was tender. That night she couldn't sleep. The word husband returned, no longer a threat, no longer just a term of necessity. Felt different, warmer. She thought of his silent provisions, his gruff, unspoken protection. He had built a fortress of solitude around himself, and now he had allowed them inside its walls. He was their shelter, and they, with their mending and their order and their quiet, persistent presence, were becoming his. They were chasing away the ghosts from the corners of his lonely world. The first sign of external threat came not as a storm cloud, but as a pair of riders cresting the hill. They were prospectors, by the look of their dusty clothes and the avaricious glint in their eyes. They reined in their horses near the forge, their gazes sweeping over the homestead with an air of appraisal. Silas, who had been hammering a length of iron, straightened up slowly, the hammer held loosely in his hand. He did not speak, merely watched them, his body a silent monument of warning. Alara, who had been tending their small fire, quickly herded her sisters back into the shadows of the barn. She peeked through a crack in the wall, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. "Quite the setup you got here, giant," the taller of the 2 men called out, a sneer twisting his lips. His name was Jedediah, a man known in the distant saloons for his cruel streak and his greed. Good well. Sturdy buildings. A man could get comfortable here. Silas remained silent. The hammer in his hand did not move. "Not much of a talker, are ya?" The second man chuckled. "That's fine. We're here to do the talking. We filed a claim on this section. Says the water rights belong to us. We'll give you a fair price for your improvements. Then you can be on your way." It was a lie and everyone knew it. They were trying to intimidate him, to bully him off the land he had clearly worked for years. They saw a lone, strange man and assumed he was simple, an easy target. Silas finally moved. He placed the hammer deliberately on the anvil. Then he took one slow step forward. "This land is mine," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like rocks grinding together, and used and rough. It was the first full sentence Alara had ever heard him speak. Jedediah laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Is it now? Got papers? A deed? Or did you just scare off the last poor soul who tried to settle here?" He swung down from his horse, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "We ain't so easily scared." He took a swaggering step towards the barn, and his eyes widened. He had seen them. He had seen the small figures of the sisters huddled in the gloom. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face. "Well, well, what have we here?" he purred, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Look what the giant's been hiding. A whole collection of little dolls." He started towards the barn door. Everything in Alara went cold. This was the moment she had always feared. The intrusion of the outside world, with all its ugliness and contempt. Before Jedediah could take another step, Silas moved. It was not a ponderous, deliberate movement this time. It was a blur of speed and force that seemed impossible for a man his size. He crossed the distance between them in 2 massive strides in his hand, the one that could craft tiny shoes, shot out and grabbed Jedediah by the front of his shirt, lifting him clean off the ground. Jedediah's feet dangled in the air, his face turning a mottled shade of red and white. His hand scrabbled for his pistol, but Silas's other hand closed around his wrist, and the sound of bone grating was sickeningly loud. Jedediah screamed, a high, thin sound of agony, and the pistol clattered to the ground. The second man, frozen in shock, finally drew his own weapon. "Put him down, you freak!" he yelled, his voice trembling. Silas did not even look at him. His gray eyes were locked on Jedediah's, and they were no longer empty. They were filled with a cold, terrifying fire, the fire of his forge. Alara knew she could not just hide. This was her home being threatened. These were her sisters. This was her husband. She saw the second man's gun wavering, his finger tightening on the trigger. Acting on pure instinct, she grabbed the heavy iron poker from their fire, its tip still glowing a dull red. With a cry that was more fury than fear, she burst from the barn door and ran, as fast as her small legs could carry her, not at the man, but at his horse. She jabbed the hot poker deep into the horse's flank. The animal shrieked in pain and terror, rearing up violently. The gunman, caught completely off guard, was thrown from the saddle, landing hard on his back with a cry of his own. His pistol flew from his grasp. Silas chose that moment to act. With a roar of pure, primal rage, he hurled Jedediah through the air. The man landed in a crumpled heap near his friend, groaning. His arm twisted at an unnatural angle. Silas strode over to them, his shadow falling over them like a death shroud. He picked up both their pistols and, with a single contemptuous twist of his hands, bent the barrels into useless, warped metal. "Get off my land," he growled, the words a promise of utter annihilation. "And if you ever come back, I will not be so gentle." The 2 men, broken and terrified, scrambled to their feet. The second man caught his spooked horse, and they rode away, not looking back, their greed and cruelty shattered against a wall of silent strength and unexpected ferocity. Silence descended upon the homestead once more. The only sounds were the ragged breathing of Alara and the low, pained whinny of the injured horse. The air was thick with the aftermath of violence. Alara stood frozen, the heavy poker still clutched in her hand, her body trembling with adrenaline. Silas turned to her. His face was grim, his chest heaving. He looked at the poker in her hand, then at her face, smudged with soot and defiance. He walked towards her, and for a terrifying second, she thought he was angry at her for her recklessness. He stopped in front of her. He reached out not to her but to the poker. His fingers gently closed around the iron shaft above hers, and he carefully took the heavy tool from her grasp, setting it aside. Then he looked at her, and his eyes held a new emotion, something beyond bewilderment or gratitude. It was respect. He raised his hand, and she flinched, but his touch was impossibly soft as his thumb brushed a smudge of soot from her cheek. His hand was warm and rough against her skin. It was the first time he had ever touched her with deliberate tenderness. "You are not hurt?" he asked, his voice still a gravelly rumble, but the harsh edge was gone. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Are you?" He shook his head, though she could see a raw scrape along his forearm where Jedediah's spurs must have caught him. Without thinking, she reached out, her small fingers tracing the edge of the wound. He stood perfectly still, allowing the contact, a giant held captive by the smallest of touches. In that moment, standing in the quiet aftermath of the storm, Alara finally understood the word that had haunted her for so long. DeSoto had not been speaking of marriage in the way her people meant it, with vows and a preacher. He had been speaking an older language, the language of the land itself. A husband was a caretaker, a protector of the household. It was a role, a duty. It was the strong trunk of a tree that allows the smaller vines to grow and flourish in its shelter, and the vines, in turn, hold the tree together. Silas was the trunk. She and her sisters were the vines. He had sheltered them, and today, in her own small way, she had helped to defend their shared root. He broke the silence, his gaze sweeping over the barn, their home. "The nights grow colder," he stated, a simple fact. "The wind finds the cracks." He paused, then looked down at her, a profound decision settling in his eyes. "I will build you a house, proper house, of stone." It was not a question. It was a declaration, promise. He was not just offering them better shelter. He was offering them permanence. He was offering them a future, woven into the fabric of his own. That evening, as the three sisters sat in their small corner, a profound peace settled over them. The fear was finally gone, burned away in the heat of the confrontation. They were no longer victims, waiting for their fate to be decided. They were participants. They were a family, a strange, unlikely clan of 4 outcasts who had found their place not in the world of men, but in a small pocket of wilderness they had claimed for their own. Later, as Alara lay on her hay-stuffed mattress, listening to the familiar, comforting sound of Silas banking the forge fire for the night, she thought of the stones he would use to build their house. Each one would be heavy, solid, and enduring. He would lift them and place them with his own powerful hands, building walls to keep out the wind and the cruelty of the world. And she, in turn, would make it a home. She would fill it with the scent of baking bread, the warmth of a fire, the quiet industry of her sisters. He would be the walls and they would be the hearth. The Apache chief had been wise after all. He hadn't left them in a giant's barn. He had planted a family in the hard, unforgiving soil and left them to grow. And as she drifted to sleep, Alara knew, with a certainty that was as solid and real as the ground beneath her, that they would not only grow, they would thrive.